Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. The Hey Chaplain podcast brings you stories and wisdom about life in law enforcement, giving support and encouragement to those who wear the badge. Here's a special treat for you. We're going back into the Hey Chaplain archives to listen to a previously unpublished portion of the interview with David Renfro. David was featured in episode 16, where he talked about his career as a federal agent working for TIGTA. Today we'll hear the other part of that interview, where he talked about his career as a reservist in the Army Criminal Investigation Division, the Army CID. And then after the interview, we'll be joined by Matt Rayburn, who was also in the Army with David and sheds a little bit more light on what the CID does. Here's David Renfro. David, I'm glad to have you here today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to talk to you.
You started out in the Air National Guard. Did you do any law enforcement work in Air National Guard?
I did. So the reason I started my career there because I knew I wanted to be in law enforcement, but at 18 or 19, you can't work in civilian law enforcement.
Sure.
I don't remember who it was, but I had a friend that told me about the Air Force Security Police that they were in the National Guard, and that sounded great, a good way to get started. So I signed up for that. That was the beginning of my law enforcement career. So Air Force Security Police back then.
Right.
I went through the Air Force Security Forces Academy, Security Police Academy. That was my first academy, and I was 19 years old. And,
oh, wow.
And it all validated what I knew. I mean, I loved it. It was great. That was.
Now, how early on in that military experience were you introduced to the CID and the idea of maybe going into something like the Criminal Investigative Division?
That was a little longer on. I started, I was 19, and I knew I wanted to be in civilian law enforcement, and that was a good way to get started. At the time, I wasn't thinking, investigations, and I really didn't know anything about CID, but I was on the police department later on, and many of the officers, several of the officers were in the CID unit there locally,
okay.
And they were telling me how great it was being a federal agent and the protection and all the things they got to do. So when my enlistment was up in the Air Force, I knew I wanted to switch over to the Army CID there. And at the time, I didn't even really think about OSI, which is the Office of Special Investigations for the Airport, which is the sister agency for Army CID.
Right.
So I jumped over into that CID unit, which, at the time I thought was great. And then a few years later, when I was deployed to Iraq for a year, I was questioning that decision. But
yeah, because that was a move from a Air National Guard unit to Army Reserves.
Right. Yeah. So I went from the Air Force to the Army, which a lot of people looked at that and said, you're doing that backwards. But it was specifically to get into the CID unit and become a CID agent because, as I progressed a little bit in law enforcement, I knew that the federal side, I could see a lot of benefits to going. As much as I enjoyed the local law enforcement, looking long term, there are a lot of benefits for going into federal law enforcement. Right.
Now, with the CID, there's several components, but a couple of them are the protection side of things, or protecting, you're doing like Secret Service type work for a general or for somebody who works in the Department of Defense or something like that. And then there's also the investigation side of it. Was there one or the other that drew you more, or did that change over time?
So when you join CID, you could do either and both in a lot of cases. It was a dual path. So CID agents could be, and I spent a year as an investigations team chief at Fort Riley, and then a year in investigations in Iraq as well. But then when I did a year mobilization up to DC to our Protective Service Battalion, and it is the same job as the Secret Service. We're high level dignitary protection, so we have the same everything. Basically, CID and the Secret Service do the same thing for different principles. Okay. And when I did that for a year, I really enjoyed that part of it more so than the investigations at that point. So I then got assigned directly to the Protective Service Battalion, where I've been for the past 10 or 11 years.
Right.
And so all I do for CID is protection missions.
Okay. And you had a year where specifically you were like with the travel team for the Secretary of Defense, right?
Right. So I mobilized for a year in 2009 to 2010 up to do full-time, be a full-time agent. And I was assigned to the travel team for, then the Secretary of Defense was Robert Gates. So for that year, all I did was travel in advance of wherever the Secretary was going to be and set up the security. Then when he landed, the team there, we would pick him up and provide, protection for him wherever he was at, and then he would leave and go to the next place. That was a lot of fun because I went to a dozen different countries.
Sure.
And got to see all kinds of things that you wouldn't get to see. High-level meetings, lots of dignitaries from other countries because that's where he was traveling. And
right.
That was a very enjoyable job, but it was a year away from the family.
Yeah.
And so that part was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. So you ended up earning a warrant officer slot. Was that how did that work out? Is that a path that every sergeant takes, or is that how does that work in the CID?
And so for the Army, it's not CID specific. So for the Army, you have the enlisted ranks, you have the officer ranks, and then you have a warrant officer ranks, which are sort of in between those. So warrant officers are commissioned officers, just like lieutenants, captains, but we're specialists.
Yeah. Whereas a lot of helicopter pilots are warrant officers.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's on the warrant corps, there's aviation, and then there's technical warrants. And so if you're not a pilot, obviously you're a technical warrant. And the difference between a warrant officer and a general officer is general officers are general in their scope of knowledge. They're not technical and tactical experts, which the warrant officers are, and warrant officers are assigned to whatever your career field is to be the technical expert in that career field, and to advise commanding officers, general officers, on the specifics of whatever your career field is. So the warrant officers are the experts in their career field, and for CID, the warrant officers are the experts in criminal investigations and protection.
So that's probably a good retention move to keep somebody who's good at being an investigator in that investigative job more than just a couple years.
Sure. And in CID, if you stay as an enlisted agent, by the time you hit E7, Sergeant First Class, then you're going to be pushed in a lot of cases into a more administrative role, detachment sergeants, command sergeant majors, that sort of thing, where you're not doing the hands-on investigations or the hands-on protection. You're sort of overseeing it, and it's much more administrative focused.
Right.
Whereas a warrant officer, you can stay hands-on in the job, and you're the team chiefs, the detachment special agent in charge, or detachment commanders, but you definitely stay more on the doing side of things as opposed to the administrative side of things.
Excellent. Okay. And what are the pros and cons of being in the CID? We talked about there's the investigative side. Let's talk about that first. If you're at a place like Fort Riley or whatever, how is that comparable? How does that compare and contrast to like being a police officer in a similar sized town?
So CID is tasked with investigating felony level crimes that affect the Army. So, for example, at Fort Riley, any death investigations, homicides, suicide, accidental deaths will be investigated by CID.
Okay.
Sexual assaults, robbery, burglary. All of the same things that a detective in a police department will look at, high felony level, more serious crimes, that is CID's purview. And CID is also a little different because you're a soldier, but you're also a sworn federal law enforcement officer. Oh. So you're kind of dual-hatted in that.
Okay.
Whereas, and it's the same for NCIS and the same for OSI. For the Air Force, and NCIS is for the Navy and the Marines. Coast Guard has CGIS, the Coast Guard Investigative Service. So more serious crimes, felony level crimes, whereas, for example, at Fort Riley, the less serious crimes, misdemeanor, what would be classified as misdemeanor crimes, the military police investigators MPI, they'll investigate that, and they can be MPs or civilians in a lot of cases now.
Okay.
At CID, the difference is it's serious felony level crimes.
Okay. What about the protective services side of things? When you're doing that, you said it was so interesting. You got to go places in advance of the Secretary of Defense, but that time away and the time focused on such a very narrow, specific task, how do you feel that did for you personally? Was that good for you as an investigator to take some time off and do something else? Was it bad for you? How do you feel about that?
It's definitely a completely different mindset, a completely different
gear to
task,
be in.
yes.
Yeah.
But you still are, and in protection, it's basically a no-fail mission. You can't have a bad day. You can't let one principal get kidnapped or so it's a no-fail mission. So while it was fun, the traveling and seeing things and working with host nation governments setting up security, it's also very stressful. And I know that my family or friends, I talk about the exciting stuff. So after missions, it's at some point, I would send pictures of all the beautiful places I got to go, and when the principal leaves, typically we're leaving the next day. So when the principal's gone, the mission's done, you get to go out and see things. So I get to go explore the pyramids in Egypt, and so looking at it, not seeing the part that I didn't share, it looks like I'm just on permanent vacation, pictures on the beach and all sorts of things. But it's definitely, while you're setting up and while it's going on, that there's a good bit of stress there, because you just, you have to prepare and be vigilant and train as if there's someone that is wanting to, attack your principal. Yeah. And so thankfully, there were no, I don't have any good war stories, and those are not the kind of stories you want.
Hopefully you don't have any. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right. There's plenty of, more, embarrassing or funny stuff that happened, but, the mission of protecting your principal, you're protecting them not just from assassination and kidnapping, which are the two big ones, but you're also protecting them from embarrassment, embarrassing themselves or embarrassing their country. Right. So when you see the Secret Service, for example, around the president, or where you see other protective details, you want it to look smooth. You want it to look imposing. Mm-hmm. You want it to look impenetrable. But if you knew the goings on underneath, it's like the analogy of the duck on the pond. It's can be quite hectic. Right. But you have to make it look like it's not. Right. And so, the stress level in that job can be very high when you're the principal's there, for sure. So
was that maybe good then to alternate back and forth between investigating, deaths and whatever versus protecting a VIP? Was that variety maybe good for you career-wise and like personal health-wise? I enjoyed it. I've always, I've always wanted to be in law enforcement. I enjoyed the law enforcement side, but after and I'm sure as you've talked to many other law enforcement officers, at some point you don't want to feel like you get in a rut. And I certainly can look at my career, and I've not ever been in a rut. It's not just taking a left or a right. It's always been moving forward, and learning another discipline, and then after doing that for a while, if there's so many opportunities and something else opens up. So CID has been very good for that for me. I wouldn't have wanted to stay doing the investigations because that takes a toll as well. I mean, you're dealing with, absolutely the worst in humanity, and seeing the worst things, and that takes a toll, as any police officer will tell you. And being in protection, I'm not responding to death and all kinds of horrible things all the time. So I absolutely am thankful that I've gotten to do that. And the protective side, some CID agents don't want to do it. They get into it. They're assigned there. They have to do it, and they'll do a good job. But they want to get back into investigations, and I have not wanted to get back into the investigation side. On the civilian side, as we'll talk about, I got to do the investigations, and I still did. But I was very happy to get into the protective side, and that's where I wanted to stay. Matt, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you, Jared.
Good. So you listened to David's interview. What did you think of his comments about his experience in Army CID?
I know, with David, he was actually that year he was activated at Fort Riley. Mm-hmm. He worked with me.
Okay.
I was a team chief there at the time, so he and I worked very closely. So I talked with him about a lot of his experiences, where he had been in the, Air Guard, and then also about his deployment, because he had previously been a year downrange.
Right.
And he and I really were downrange about the same time. I just didn't run into him where
Sure.
I was at. So I was kind of roving all over Iraq.
He mentioned doing like an accident investigation. Mm-hmm. Was that typical of the kind of things you worked on?
Yeah, at that time we were doing all the felony investigations, but we were
a
lot of times covering for all the services as well, particularly suicides, even friendly fire deaths. At the time, there was a mentality that since President Bush had announced the cease of combat operations, that any further actions were trying to be worked as murders within the Iraqi criminal court. So when IEDs would go off and units were attacked, we're trying to identify that, and see if we could get those individuals identified. And a lot of times they were already rounded up and at Abu Ghraib. So they were questioned, there as well. So
okay, now forgive me, I don't know. Were you an NCO or warrant officer or commissioned officer?
Warrant officer.
Okay, so you and David both were warrant officers in the Army, in the CID. Okay,
correct.
And so David seemed to prefer the protection assignments, doing VIP protection, but that wasn't your experience in the CID, right?
No, I had really no protection mission experience whatsoever.
Okay.
Other than doing some local support as missions might have come in. Principals were coming in to visit a location, and their advanced team would come in for intel and meet and greet, and if they needed any support from there.
Right.
But no, I didn't have an assignment with protection whatsoever. And
so you did primarily like felony investigation in the Army.
Correct.
That was your primary thing. Any particular highlights over the course of your career that you found interesting?
Yes, I mean a lot of them. There's always always have those great cases where you feel you really brought justice.
Yeah.
And then that fact that we did investigate all death investigations that occurred on the military installation, because in the end we were there to investigate on behalf of the United States Army.
Right.
So even if prosecutors said, "Hey, we're not taking this case to court," or "There's no criminal offense," we were still charged to investigate on behalf of the Army.
Sure.
So it was good and bad in some of the criminal cases as well. Whereas you would, our counterparts in the civilian, local law enforcement and federal, if their prosecutor said this isn't going forward, they dropped the case.
Right.
But we continued with these cases, even if we didn't have victim cooperation. So at times there was some negative aspects to that, but it was all on the behalf of the Army. But those cases where, maybe you actually help a family, someone's unfortunately taken their own life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was at the onset, no one wants to believe that their son or daughter, their loved one, could do that.
Right.
And as you kind of walk through there and bring them to a closure, point of information, help them get all the reports and let them see that, hey, I am not here to cover up, because that was always kind of the the first thing you'd hear.
Yeah.
Right. Is that I was a company man for the Army and I was there to sweep it under the rug. Absolutely not. We're there to lift the rug up so you can see.
Yeah.
And, we would work with the commanders as well, because they'd have their requirements and have their 15-6 officers that was assigned to try to identify some things within the unit. But, in the end, we brought all that together, and it, then becomes part of the records repository. Mm-hmm. So if down the road someone wants to say, hey, the Army did this, well, here's the records. You can request them.
Right.
They may be redacted, but, lots of experiences like that. And it's always great seeing someone that is predatorial on children. Yeah. That day that you sit in court and you hear that they're getting sentenced.
Yeah.
That's always a great feeling.
feel like you did good and made a difference. That's important in any area of law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I mean, over an 18-year period, there's quite a few of those. And there's some unique stories that probably wouldn't be appropriate for this this forum.
There's always those. Yes. Yeah.
But there's a lot of great times with that. A lot of hard work to get there.
Sure.
So
was it common to experience what you experienced where you stayed almost entirely on the investigation side? Because I've had the impression that the CID folks get moved over, and they kind of have to switch hats over to protection, and that sometimes that's even problematic that, I can't focus on this job because I keep getting moved over to this other job.
Right.
Was it common for people to stay in one field and be there the whole time?
There was different viewpoints, and it really depended what the leadership,
sure,
and some of the senior warrants or assignment warrant thought at the time, because there was a belief that kind of one camp that it was about being balanced, and you needed that assignment to be balanced. And a lot of times you might get that as an NCO, but my concern getting that as a warrant officer is that it's a very technical job.
Yeah.
And as the warrant officer, you're supposed to be that technical expert in the field.
Yeah, you're supposed to be specialized, right?
And you're pulling out someone from investigations for 3 years as a W1, W2, and then you bring them back, and all of a sudden they're expected to be in charge of a team, and policies changed, federal laws have changed,
sure,
CMJ's changed,
sure,
and their head's spinning. So especially if they go to a smaller office, the way the offices were set up, if it was something smaller, it could have even more of an impact. But
Okay. So the CID is in the process of being transformed into a mostly civilian federal law enforcement agency. Now, I know you're not in it now, but do you think that'll help? Will that improve things?
I think it definitely has the likelihood to improve things. One, it just brings kind of the stability to the folks there. That was the thing as I went around, and as you would get to know detectives and federal law enforcement agents in the areas that you were at, they were very apprehensive at first to get to know you, to work with you. They didn't know your background. They didn't know your history. Because where a lot of these individuals, once they joined a police force, they stayed at that police force. Maybe they did their patrol time. Now they're a detective and they're a supervisor, but they've been there, and maybe they've moved around from a local PD to a county, but in that area, and they know the area.
Right.
And that was just that piece that warrants typically moved every 3 years. Enlisted a lot of times were as soon as 2 years they were moving. So just having that familiarity with folks and with an area even, because everything's a little bit different, especially when it comes to federal jurisdiction on a U.S. territory, especially when you're dealing with kids, and there is no code of law for kids federally, and you're trying to apply that, because you do have child offenders that happen, juvenile offenders, and trying to figure all that out. So if there were severe cases, occasionally we would get local prosecutors to pick them up.
Right.
But again, there just wasn't the, juvenile justice within the, the federal government. It's not meant for that. That's meant for the state. But it's a unique enclave here in the middle of a particular state. So,
and your thinking is that a civilian employee who's got more stability, probably going to be there longer, that in theory they would have better connections to prosecute that kind of thing better. Right.
Well, they're going to be able to build those relationships with the county prosecutors, with the local law enforcement, and it's great to have things written down like this is how it should work, but still there's still a lot of tacit knowledge especially when it's come to relationships and building those bridges. And it takes a lot of work, when you run an office and try to build those bridges with your local law enforcement on the local levels, the county level, the state level, federal level, and make it a big, make sure you're in that partnership.
Sure. Let me back up a little bit and ask, why did you get into Army CID?
Well, I came in like a breech baby into CID, to be honest with you. So it was a unique opportunity, and I'm forever grateful for the opportunity. But originally I was, in college. I joined the Army Reserves. I spent 8 years in the Army Reserves. I was a high school history teacher and coached, football and girls track and wrestling. And I was 4 years into that. And I joined active duty to go to flight school. And I was 3/4 of the way through flight school, but I had some flight control issues. So ended up doing a branch transfer over to CID. They took me in. It was, I was right as I came in, I was, about a year into being a warrant officer, because I went directly as a warrant.
Right.
So I had a steep learning curve.
So no law enforcement background before this?
No.
Oh, wow.
No.
Okay.
And that's the unique thing about CID is, that it was an open transfer for anyone. And there was kind of, again, about that blend. It wasn't all just MPs that came over to be agents.
Right. Okay.
It was a feeder from all MOSs. So, if you had someone stealing from supply systems, you try to figure out in your office, like, hey, you were supply, right? Like, yeah, I was.
Oh, sure.
All right, come here.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and you'd have a lot of folks like that. So it was unique kind of a background.
Okay. So back to the transition CID is going through, in your opinion, will they always need to have some uniformed personnel in the office in order to properly investigate the Army? Can a totally civilian group do that effectively?
I can't say one way or the other. I think it could.
Okay.
But the one thing you're going to run into is, while there's mobility agreements, people can still quit their job, like if it comes to deployments, things like that.
Right.
Whereas a green suiter, you don't get that choice.
No, you have to go where you're told. That's right.
Pack your AV bags, you're going. So
right.
There is that aspect. I think what we're really going to see is there's levels of bureaucracy that's being cut out of what was in place when I was in.
Okay.
This is putting law enforcement in charge of CID, where the folks in charge were MP officers. There wasn't necessarily always a law enforcement background there.
Okay. So removing bureaucracy and keeping, having leadership, that comes from the right point of view. I mean, that's probably going to be helpful, right?
Right.
Make it more effective. Right.
Yes. And it's going to look more like NCIS. I mean, The civilian director hired was former deputy director for NCIS.
Okay. So
they're going to mirror each other.
Excellent.
I do believe, in my opinion.
Will Army CID eventually get their own TV show?
They were supposed to. They actually had it.
Oh, I didn't know.
They did. Yeah. They did a pilot series, and it was called CID Delta.
Okay.
But then there just wasn't support for it from Army CID. So
maybe civilians will get the Hollywood producers back in the room again.
Right.
I don't even know if that's a good thing or not, but yeah.
And when you try to explain Army CID to folks that really don't know the military, and you're like, well, you've seen NCIS, and they're like, oh, and I'm like, and Jethro Gibbs, right? Oh yeah. Well, that's kind of what I did.
Right.
Just not quite that as cool as him.
There's usually the Hollywood version usually has more explosions and gunfights and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and
less paperwork.
They solved everything in 45 minutes in one episode. So
that's exactly right. Exactly.
I've got all their lab results back in the field on the fly. So
that wasn't your experience?
No, not at all.
That's excellent. Okay. Hey, thank you for your service, and thank you for talking to me about Army CID. I appreciate it.
No, absolutely.
I've been sitting on the Army CID part of David's interview for almost 6 months, and I'm so happy to get to share that unique side of law enforcement with you. And thank you to Matt Rayburn for adding so much. I had a great conversation with him. You can learn so much about a person by talking to his Army buddies. And don't worry, David, Matt only said good things about you, at least while we were recording. If you've worked in investigations in the military or as an MP, I'd like to hear from you. Perhaps you're local law enforcement. You've got the chance to partner with military investigators from time to time. Please contact me at the Hey Chaplain Facebook page and tell me about your experiences. I want to share your stories, and especially if you have wisdom to share about thriving in law enforcement, I want other cops to hear what you have to say. If you like what you heard here, please share this episode with a cop or someone who loves a cop. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
And after the funeral, we couldn't get Carolyn to answer a phone call. She wouldn't answer a knock at her door. She wouldn't respond to any notes that we sent her. So one day I said to the chief, I said, Chief, do you know how Carolyn Claggett's doing? And he said, yeah, she's doing fine. And I said, we've sent her cards, calling her, dropping by her house. She won't answer the door. You really think she's fine? He goes, oh my gosh, yes, we know she's fine. I said, how do you know that? He said, on the day that we buried Rusty, I gave her my card and said, if you ever need any help, call us. And she's never called.
Oh. The views expressed here are the personal views of our host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components, or the Department of Defense or its components. Thank you for listening today, and as always, pray for peace in our city.